We're going to begin this hour with breaking news. Just into us now, the FBI has arrested a suspect accused of planting the pipe bombs that had been left outside the RNC and DNC headquarters the night before the January 6th Capitol riot.
At 4:17 a.m. Central Time, across warehouse districts in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, 3 federal strike teams converged on coordinates that had been classified for 19 months. No press notifications. No local police involvement, just FBI tactical units, DEA enforcement squads, and IC special operations moving through fog so thick that thermal imaging became the only reliable navigation tool. The first target sat behind a decommissioned grain elevator on the industrial fringe of Hennepin County. On paper, it was registered as overflow storage for a medical equipment redistribution nonprofit. In reality, it was a transshipment hub capable of processing 14 tons of narcotics per fiscal quarter without triggering a single inspection flag. The breach came at 4:22 a.m. precisely. Hydraulic rams shattered reinforced door frames. Flashbang grenades detonated in calculated sequence, each one timed to disorient without causing permanent injury. Agents in black tactical gear poured through the openings like shadows given physical form, their movements rehearsed to the second. Inside, the scale revealed itself immediately. Rows of shrink-wrap containers stretched toward the back wall, each one labeled with humanitarian shipping codes that would have granted reduced scrutiny at any port of entry in North America. The labels read medical rehabilitation equipment. The contents told a different story. K9 units alerted within seconds. Portable analyzers confirmed what no benefits fraud case should ever uncover: high-purity fentanyl residue, methamphetamine precursors, vacuum-sealed bricks of cocaine wrapped in industrial plastic. The smell of chemical processing hung in the air, faint but unmistakable to agents who had spent years in cartel enforcement. 784 crates. That was the final count across all 3 sites. And when forensic teams began cataloging contents, the numbers became almost incomprehensible. 2.1 million fentanyl pills. Enough to kill every resident of the Twin Cities metropolitan area twice over. 14 kilograms of pure heroin. 63 kilograms of methamphetamine. And nearly 400 pounds of cocaine that had been staged for distribution across a 12-state corridor. But the drugs were not the discovery that changed everything. In a reinforced compartment beneath the floor plates of the primary warehouse, agents found something that made senior investigators pause mid-operation. Encrypted hard drives. Sealed steel boxes containing financial ledgers. Server racks still warm from recent activity. And most disturbing of all, a communications hub with direct encrypted links to 17 law enforcement databases across the upper Midwest. The cartel had not simply built a drug corridor, they had built an intelligence operation. And the scope of what they had achieved would take months to fully comprehend. By 6:14 a.m., as the first light of dawn crept across the frozen Minnesota landscape, the operation shifted from tactical to analytical. Forensic teams established a mobile processing center in the parking lot of a seized trucking depot, their equipment humming with the effort of cracking encryption protocols that had been designed to resist exactly this kind of intrusion. Inside an FBI cyber forensics unit, analysts worked in near silence. The only sounds were keyboard clicks and the occasional sharp intake of breath as another layer of the network revealed itself. What they found was not a criminal enterprise. It was a corporate structure. The operation had a name. Internal documents referred to it as Project Meridian, and its organizational chart read like a Fortune 500 company rather than a drug trafficking network. There were departments for logistics, compliance, human resources, and government relations. There were quarterly reports and performance metrics. There were even employee satisfaction surveys. At the center of the diagram sat a single encrypted authorization key. Every major decision, every significant financial transfer, every strategic pivot in the network's operations had required approval from this key. And when analysts finally traced its origin, the blood drained from their faces. The key belonged to a digital signature registered to the office of Minnesota's Deputy Attorney General, a man named Harrison Cole, a man who had spent 11 years building a reputation as one of the state's most aggressive prosecutors of organized crime. Cole had not been fighting the cartel, he had been directing it. The evidence was systematic. Financial records showed monthly transfers to offshore accounts in Cole's wife's maiden name. Communication logs revealed encrypted conversations with known Sinaloa cartel lieutenants dating back 6 years. And most damning of all, internal memos showed Cole providing advance warning of every major drug enforcement operation in the state for nearly a decade. Every raid that came up empty, every investigation that stalled, every case that collapsed just before trial. Cole had been there, Cole had known, and Cole had acted. But Harrison Cole was not the apex of the pyramid. He was merely the most visible piece of a corruption network that extended far deeper than anyone had imagined. The financial web stretched across 347 separate bank accounts distributed among 61 shell companies, 14 non-profit organizations, and 9 government-adjacent consulting firms. Money moved through the system like blood through capillaries, never staying in one place long enough to coagulate into evidence. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Medicaid reimbursement claims would flood into legitimate healthcare providers. Within 48 hours, the funds would be fragmented into dozens of smaller transfers, each one just below mandatory reporting thresholds. Those transfers would feed into shell companies that existed only as post office boxes and registered agent addresses. And from there, the money would vanish into overseas accounts before emerging, laundered and clean, to purchase real estate, vehicles, and political influence. Over 5 years, $146 million had moved through this network. The drugs flowed north, the money flowed south, and the system that was supposed to protect American citizens had been converted into a conveyor belt for cartel operations. Analysts mapped the distribution routes with growing horror. Trucking contractors operating under healthcare logistics licenses moved product across state lines without inspection. Weigh stations mysteriously went offline for maintenance whenever flagged vehicles approached. Border checkpoints reported equipment malfunctions that coincided precisely with known cartel convoy schedules. The infrastructure was not improvised. It was engineered. And at the heart of it all sat a courthouse verdict that had vanished like morning mist. At 6:47 a.m., Federal Command authorized the next phase. Operation Meridian Sunrise would be the largest coordinated drug enforcement action in Minnesota history, and it would begin in exactly 90 minutes. The command center occupied the 3rd floor of a federal building in downtown Minneapolis. Digital screens covered every wall, each one displaying a different aspect of the operation about to unfold. Red markers pulsed across a map of the upper Midwest, each one representing a target location, a known associate, or a critical infrastructure node in the cartel's network. 47 targets across 14 counties. 1,247 federal agents from FBI, DEA, IC, DHS, and ATF.
14 SWAT teams.
6 Black Hawk helicopters providing aerial surveillance and rapid response capability. And in reserve, 2 U.S. Army National Guard units ready to provide perimeter security if the operation escalated beyond civilian law enforcement capacity. The briefing was short. The agents knew their assignments. They had been preparing for this moment for 19 months. At 8:15 a.m., the first wave launched. Across Minneapolis, simultaneous breaches shattered the morning quiet. A luxury condominium in the North Loop district, registered to a shell company traced to Harrison Cole's brother-in-law, yielded $3.2 million in cash and a collection of documents linking the Deputy Attorney General to cartel operations dating back to 2019. A warehouse in the industrial zone near the Mississippi River contained a drug superlab capable of pressing 50,000 fentanyl pills per day. Agents found 3 cartel chemists still in the building, their lab coats stained with the blue dye used to mark authentic product. A suburban home in Edina, owned by a man who claimed to be a retired accountant, contained server equipment worth more than $2 million and communication logs showing real-time coordination with Sinaloa cartel leadership in Mexico. The pattern repeated across the region. Strike teams hit targets in Rochester, Duluth, St. Cloud, and Mankato. Each location revealed another piece of the network. Each seizure added to the mounting evidence of systematic corruption. By noon, the numbers had become almost surreal. 17 tons of narcotics seized, $43 million in cash recovered, 312 individuals detained for processing, and 37 active law enforcement officers placed under immediate suspension pending investigation. The cartel had not simply bribed a few corrupt cops. They had built a parallel enforcement system, a shadow police force whose loyalty belonged not to the people of Minnesota, but to the Sinaloa organization. Internal affairs investigators would later determine that the compromise reached every level of state law enforcement. Patrol officers had been paid to ignore specific vehicles. Detectives had been paid to lose evidence. Sergeants had been paid to reassign investigators away from sensitive cases. And supervisors had been paid to look the other way while all of it happened.
The betrayal cut deep.
Honest officers who had spent decades building cases against organized crime discovered that their own colleagues had been sabotaging those cases from within. Evidence that should have led to convictions had been contaminated. Witnesses who should have been protected had been exposed. And operations that should have succeeded had been compromised before they ever launched. The badge had been turned into a weapon against the people it was supposed to protect. At 2:34 p.m., federal agents arrived at the home of Harrison Cole. The Deputy Attorney General was not there. His wife claimed he had left for work that morning as usual. His office claimed he had called in sick. His phone went directly to voicemail. 6 hours later, Cole's vehicle was found abandoned at a private airstrip outside Rochester. Flight records showed a charter plane had departed for Mexico at 7:43 a.m., 3 hours before the first raid launched. Someone had warned him. Someone inside the operation had given him time to run. The investigation into that leak would continue for months. But the message was clear. The corruption extended beyond what anyone had mapped. And the network's survival instinct was stronger than its structural integrity. Yet Cole's escape did not stop the operation. It accelerated it. By sunset on the first day, federal prosecutors had begun assembling the largest RICO case in Minnesota history. The indictment would eventually name 147 defendants across 12 states. It would document a criminal enterprise that had generated over $400 million in revenue over 7 years. And it would trace the network's origins to a single meeting in a Culiacan safe house where Sinaloa leadership had decided to experiment with a new approach to American market penetration. The old model of cartel operations relied on violence and intimidation. The new model relied on integration and corruption. Rather than fighting the system, they would become the system. Rather than evading law enforcement, they would control it. Minnesota had been chosen as the pilot program. Its location made it ideal, far enough from the border to avoid obvious scrutiny, close enough to major transportation corridors to facilitate nationwide distribution, and politically positioned in a way that made aggressive prosecution unpopular among certain constituencies. The cartel had studied American politics with the precision of graduate students. They understood that certain narratives would provide cover for their operations. They understood that certain accusations would be dismissed as political attacks rather than investigated as crimes. And they understood that the American justice system's commitment to due process could be weaponized against itself. The verdict that had vanished was not an accident. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept showing that even when the evidence was overwhelming, even when the jury was unanimous, even when the facts were undisputed, the system could still be made to fail. All it required was the right judge, the right argument, and the right moment of hesitation. Judge Patricia Holloway had presided over the original fraud case. She had been appointed to the bench 8 years earlier after a career in corporate defense litigation. Her campaign had been funded, in part, by a political action committee that investigators would later trace to shell companies connected to the Meridian network. Holloway had not taken a bribe in the traditional sense. There was no evidence of direct payment, no offshore account, no stack of cash in a safe deposit box. But the money had flowed, and the decisions had followed. Her ruling overturning the jury verdict had cited a single legal theory: the possibility that an unidentified third party might have been responsible for the criminal conduct. No evidence supported this theory. No witness suggested it. No document pointed to it. But the possibility alone was enough to introduce reasonable doubt after the fact. It was a legal innovation that sent shockwaves through prosecution offices across the country. If a unanimous verdict could be overturned based on theoretical possibilities unsupported by evidence, then no conviction was safe. The standard of proof had been inverted. Certainty was no longer enough. Absolute metaphysical certainty was now required. Defense attorneys celebrated the ruling as a victory for constitutional rights. Prosecutors recognized it for what it was: a roadmap for dismantling any case, no matter how strong, by introducing doubt at the final moment. Within weeks of the ruling, 7 other cases built on similar evidence patterns were quietly paused. Prosecutors began asking not whether they could prove guilt, but whether their proof could survive a Holloway-style challenge. The chill spread through the system like frost through autumn leaves. And behind it all, the cartel watched and learned. The scope of what investigators eventually uncovered extended far beyond Minnesota's borders. The Meridian network had been designed as a prototype, a template that could be replicated across the country. Documents recovered from seized servers revealed planning for similar operations in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Each state had been analyzed for vulnerabilities. Each state had potential assets identified for recruitment. Each state had a timeline for development. The cartel was not simply running drugs. They were building an empire, a permanent infrastructure for narcotics distribution that would operate inside the legitimate economy rather than alongside it. The ambition was breathtaking. Within 10 years, cartel leadership projected they would control distribution networks in 38 states. They would have compromised officials in every major law enforcement agency. They would have judges on payroll, prosecutors on retainer, and legislators on speed dial. The American heartland would become a cartel colony, and no one would even notice it had happened. The human cost of this ambition could be measured in obituaries. Fentanyl overdose deaths in Minnesota had tripled over the 5 years of the network's operation. Emergency rooms had been overwhelmed with patients whose hearts had stopped after taking what they thought was prescription medication. Families had buried children, parents had buried spouses, and communities had buried their futures. Each death represented a victory for the network. Each funeral represented profit. Each grieving family represented a market successfully penetrated. The drugs moved through the system like poison through veins. They arrived in warehouses disguised as medical equipment. They were processed in labs disguised as legitimate businesses. They were distributed through channels that had been built and protected by the very agencies sworn to stop them. And every time someone asked questions, the system provided answers that sounded reasonable but revealed nothing. Federal investigators would spend months untangling the full scope of the corruption. The final accounting would include 847 identified instances where law enforcement action had been compromised by cartel influence, 312 cases that should have resulted in convictions but were derailed by internal sabotage, and 47 known overdose deaths that might have been prevented if the network had been exposed earlier. The badge had been betrayed, the bench had been corrupted, and the system that Americans trusted to protect them had been converted into a weapon against them. Yet the story does not end in despair. The operation that began at 4:17 a.m. on that frozen Minnesota morning represented something more than a law enforcement success. It represented a choice. A decision by honest agents, honest analysts, and honest prosecutors that the system could still be saved. They had known the risks. They had known that colleagues might be compromised. They had known that evidence might disappear. They had known that their careers might be destroyed if they were wrong. But they had acted anyway, because they understood something that the cartel had forgotten to factor into their calculations. The system is not made of rules. It is made of people. And when enough people decide that corruption will not stand, no amount of money, no amount of influence, and no amount of legal innovation can protect those who have betrayed the public trust. Harrison Cole remains a fugitive. Mexican authorities have provided assurances of cooperation that no one believes. His face appears on wanted posters in 37 federal buildings. And the $5 million reward for information leading to his capture grows larger every month. Judge Patricia Holloway resigned from the bench 3 weeks after federal agents delivered a subpoena to her chambers. She has not been charged with any crime, but her name has become synonymous with the corruption of American justice, and her legacy will be the warning that judicial independence requires judicial integrity. The 147 defendants named in the RICO indictment face a combined potential sentence of over 4,000 years in federal prison. The first trials are scheduled to begin next month, and prosecutors have promised that no plea bargain will be offered to any defendant who refuses to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations. The network has been disrupted. The corridor has been closed. The infrastructure has been dismantled, but the damage remains. Families still grieve for those who died from drugs that should never have reached American streets. Communities still struggle to rebuild trust in institutions that were supposed to protect them. And the question that hangs over everything remains unanswered. How did it get this far? How did a criminal organization build an empire inside the machinery of American justice without anyone noticing until it was almost too late? The answer is uncomfortable. The cartel succeeded because we let them. They succeeded because we were too busy fighting each other to notice the enemy in our midst. They succeeded because we trusted badges without questioning the people who wore them. They succeeded because we believed that the system would protect itself.
It didn't.
Systems don't protect themselves.
People protect systems.
And when people fail to act, systems fail to function. This story is not about Minnesota.
It is about America.
It is about what happens when we stop paying attention. It is about what happens when we assume that corruption is someone else's problem. It is about what happens when we trust without verifying. Power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives in silence, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. Sometimes it files paperwork instead of firing weapons. Sometimes it corrupts instead of conquers. And sometimes, by the time we notice, it has already won. The operation succeeded. The network fell. The cartels suffered a defeat that will echo through their organization for years. But the victory is not complete. It never is. Because somewhere, right now, someone is studying what went wrong for the Meridian network. Someone is identifying the mistakes that led to exposure. Someone is planning how to do it better next time. The price of freedom is not just vigilance against foreign enemies. It is vigilance against the corruption that grows in the shadows of our own institutions. It is the courage to ask uncomfortable questions. It is the willingness to believe that the unthinkable might already be happening. If you watch this far, you understand what's at stake. You understand that stories like this matter. You understand that silence is how corruption survives. Tap like so more people can see what was hidden. Comment expose if you believe the public deserves to know the truth. Subscribe so these investigations can continue to reach those who still believe in accountability. This was a fictional dramatization, but the threats it depicts are real, and the choice it presents is yours. What happened in Minnesota was a warning. The question now is whether we will heed it.